I'm Eric Barnes with the Daily Memphian, and welcome to the Sidebar, the weekly show on the community, arts, culture, and more. And today we're talking to Willy Bearden, writer and filmmaker, so stay with us for a conversation with Willy. And a special thanks to our sponsor, Treasevant Manor. Willy, thanks for being here.
Hey, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to see you.
Yeah, no, thanks. Was it a year, maybe a year and a half since you've been on? So
yeah, I think so.
In that time, you've written a book, your memoir.
Yes, I have. I've been working on this for several years, just kind of in and around a lot of other projects. I stay very busy, and but I finally got it done late last year, and then it took me a few months to go through and make all the changes that my editors had me making, and it was officially released and available like on Amazon last week, so July 9th.
Yeah.
And just kind of an arbitrary date.
And Mississippi Hippie, A Life in 49 Pieces.
Yeah.
You told me you started writing this over as we were riding up the elevator here in Crosstown on the 10th floor of the atrium, so people can hear Crosstown behind us.
Yeah.
You started it as a work of fiction.
I did. I wrote it as a work of fiction, and I started in 2011 when I had just come back from India getting my heart bypassed.
And do a whole podcast on that, I'm sure.
And I thought I was going to die. I didn't think I was going to be around long. And I thought, well, there's some things I want to say and some things I want to kind of get straight in my mind about my life. And so I started writing it, but I wrote it as a novel. And I wrote this thing. It took me probably like 15 months to write. And I wrote like 110,000 words. I mean,
That's a lot of words.
A lot of words. But, I got it kind of where I wanted to, then handed it off to my editors. Worked on it for a few years in and out of other projects, sometimes of the year. I mean, I can't touch anything else for 3 or 4 months. I'm working on some things, so I would work on it as I could. And finally, in 2019, one of my editors, David Tankersley, who I've written with a lot, told me, he said, man, you're going to hate me, but your true stories are so much better than the fiction you had to put around them to make this. Right? And I knew he was right. In that moment, I knew he was right. And so I started kind of unwinding the fiction, and it's taken me since 2019 to do that. But while I was unwinding that, I thought of so many other things I wanted to write. So about 50% of the book is new stuff.
Yeah.
And that was good because just telling these stories, I thought these are more universal in nature. And I think that people can relate to these. And I, talked a lot about growing up in Rolling Fork and all that. Yeah. And hanging around the pool hall, and my mother was a beautician. So when I was a kid, I hung around the beauty shop, and you hear everything in the beauty shop.
Yep.
And then you hear more in the pool hall. And, so after I got finished with it, I thought, man, this is like, it's maybe, I don't know what I would call it, but maybe Mississippi Delta pool hall existentialism or something, because it's like.
I gotta write that down. Hang on. Keep talking. I'm writing
I just made that up. But
that can be your next book.
Yeah, right. A very long title. But, I really kind of hung in there, and more I kept thinking about the people who had been in my life, that I'd known, but who were no longer here, people who had died.
Yeah.
And that became kind of a recurring theme in the book.
Yeah.
And there was some comfort in that while I was writing and just thinking about these people, because they were so present with me while I was writing. And I really got the sense that, nobody's ever really gone.
Yeah.
Everybody's right here with you.
I'm going to do a poor job of reading your work, which is the opening line of the book.
Yeah.
I once kept a list of everyone I knew who had died. I was 11. I began the list in the back of a spiral-bound composition notebook. I kept it hidden under a bookcase in my small bedroom.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And that's true.
Yeah.
That is absolutely true. And my mother found that. And she thought it was Willy's getting weirder than I thought he was. And I just hit it better after that. But what that did for me is, I think, kind of the trauma that I went through growing up in an alcoholic home, and this chaos that people go through, and so many people go through.
Yeah.
That was somehow comforting to me, to know that people who had been there, people I could still hear their voices, but they weren't in attendance anymore.
Yeah.
And that everything was going to be all right. I think that's what I came back to. And, back in and this was the early 60s. When I started that list, it was probably 1961.
Yeah.
And people didn't talk about alcoholism. People, back then, if people went to a 12-step program like AA or something, you'd lose your job if your boss found out, which is weird. You're helping yourself, you're handling your problems, but you'd lose your job if somebody knew you went to AA.
Yeah.
So now people talk about those things, and now there are, I don't even think, if you're thinking about, was there a counselor even in the Mississippi Delta? Well, I would say probably no.
Probably not, yeah. That's an interesting thing. Again, we're here with Willy Bearden. This is The Sidebar. I'm Eric Barnes. Talking about Willy's new book, Mississippi Hippie, A Life in 49 Pieces. It reminds me, I remember one time watching an interview, forgive a slight digression, with Dan Aykroyd talking about John Belushi dying. And he just said, that was whatever in the 70s. He goes, it was so different then. People didn't talk about rehab and drug abuse. And I like in hindsight knew what was happening, but I didn't really register it. I remember an interview with Jimmy Page about John Bonham saying the same thing. Like, I knew lots of people who would have 30 drinks a night and go to bed. It was just normalized in a way that now you can see how incredibly unhealthy and sad and awful it is.
Yeah, and I think I wrote a piece, one of the 49 pieces is called The Fluid Nature of the Truth.
Yeah.
And I think about that a lot.
Yeah.
What is true today was not true 40 years ago and 50 years ago. It was just not true.
Yeah.
And so all of those things were kind of revelations to me in setting out on the world and having to make my own way and having to make sense out of all these things.
Yeah.
And I think now at 73 years old, I'm so pleased at how I've turned out, because so many people would have, I don't know, been in jail, dead, whatever. But just kind of something happened to me. And what happened to me is reading.
Yeah.
I started reading because my mother found out that I couldn't read when I was 10 or 11 years old.
Really?
Yes. And she confronted me with it. And I was, well, of course I can read. I couldn't read.
And you'd been in school?
I'd been in school. Yeah. I did not make good grades. Right. But so she told me, she said, listen, you're going to go to the library. We had a nice little library in Rolling Fork. She said, you're going to go to the library tomorrow and you're going to get a book. I don't care if it's a second grade book. And I was probably in the 7th grade, 6th grade at the time. She said, you're going to read that book and you're going to get another one. She said, don't let anybody see you if it's a book that's going to embarrass you. But you're going to get that book and you're going to read it. And you know what? I did.
Yeah.
And I started reading then, and I have read, 10,000 books since then. So it saved my life, being able to do that and being able to step out of who I was and my reality into someone else's reality and see how they handled things.
Yeah. When you were writing the book as fiction, was the impetus there that you didn't think your actual stories would be interesting enough, or was it a sense of I want to protect myself and the people, or maybe some of both?
I think it was some of both. There were people that I didn't want to identify, and in the book I don't really, I changed names and things. Yeah. But a lot of it was that let me see if I can make a compelling story that has a consistent theme, running. And so I made myself a completely opposite of who I am. And then
that was your therapy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, let me project myself onto this other character and see what he would think and see how he would look at things. It was an interesting practice, I guess, for sitting there and getting it from your head down to the paper. And I've always been pretty good at getting things from my head down on paper pretty quickly and all that. I could sit down when I was writing that. I would sit down and write 3,000 words in a day, just kind of, bang it out and it would be okay,
those tricks, like, my other life where I write books, for the fourth book that was published, I remember when I started that book, I was like, I'm not writing another book that's remotely derivative of my life. Yeah. I'm going to someplace else entirely. This is going to totally not be me. And I'm like 40 pages into it, and I realized I started with a single dad with his 2 children from his marriage in the backseat. I'm like, at the time, I was a single dad, it was like, God, I didn't even aware how, as obvious as it was, I wasn't aware of what I was doing.
It's hard to get away from yourself. Yeah. And I don't think you need to get away from yourself, really. I mean, people who make up stuff, I'm like, okay, man, that's great. Yeah. That's wonderful. You've made this world. But when it comes down to it, I just wanted to tell the truth about my situation and my experience. I thought I had fairly unique experience out there hitchhiking around the world and doing all those things and coming to Memphis in the early 70s. Yeah. And Memphis was crazy back then. I mean, people think Memphis is dangerous now. I drove a liquor delivery truck. Oh, man. And, just all this and just, fell in love with a Hare Krishna girl, who was dancing downtown. There's just so much. And some of the things maybe are a little indelicate in there, but sure. Somebody asked me recently, said, you didn't really try to make yourself look good necessarily in this. I said,
but you're good now.
Yeah, I am good now. But I will say, these are the things that I did that were wrong and all that. But I also realized that being the valedictorian of your class is a wonderful thing. But the valedictorians of their classes rarely write the great book or make the great record or whatever. Sure. You got to be a little shaky somewhere to tell to live a good story and to tell that story.
We're here with Willy Bearden talking about his new book, Mississippi Hippie, A Life in 49 Pieces. You mentioned Amazon. People can get it.
Yes. Where? Yeah. Well, it's available, I know, at Novel out in East Memphis now. And people who aren't here in Memphis, you can get it on Amazon. All right. And the audiobook is coming out. I narrated the audiobook. And let me tell you that I wish I had some professional help, Natalie, in editing that. Believe me, I wanted to quit several times. It probably took me 40 hours to read that thing because it's altogether edited. It's like 7.5 hours, but. I wanted to read it. I wanted to tell that story.
It would have to be in your voice. It would have to. Let me do this. Let me do a little housekeeping real quick. Again, we've got more questions. We'll talk more with Willy Bearden here. A reminder, though, that this is The Sidebar. I'm Eric Barnes. The Sidebar airs on WYXR 91.7 every Thursday at 11:30, focused on the community, arts, culture, everything in between. It's not just a radio show, though. It's one of many weekly podcasts we do at the Daily Memphian, including our politics podcast, On the Record, hosted by Bill Dries. Sometimes Sam Hardiman's in there. We have our Memphis Grizzlies podcast hosted by Drew Hill and Chris Harrington, and our food podcast, Soundbites, that's hosted by Jennifer Chandler, food writer who came over to the Daily Memphian about 6 weeks ago. And it airs here on WYXR Thursday at 11, right before The Sidebar. We also host a podcast version of Behind the Headlines, which we produce with the folks over at WKNO every week. And all of our podcasts are on the Daily Memphian site, as well as iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. You can get this show at WYXR.org as well, or the WYXR app. It includes all the shows on WYXR, talk and music, archives of the past shows. It's a great way to keep up with the DJs and other things going on here at WYXR. WYXR is nonprofit listener-supported radio, so consider becoming a member or doing a one-off donation. If you become a member, you get all kinds of cool stuff. It is the radio station, though, is supported by its listeners. And if you aren't already a paid subscriber to the Daily Memphian, do become a paid subscriber. We're a nonprofit, the largest newsroom in the region, and very much thank everyone who is a paid subscriber and encourage everyone to become one. Recently on the show, we had Toby Sells, also with a new book about the paranormal and the South.
I've been reading this book. It's a great book. Hey Blues. Yeah, I love it.
We love Toby. But Toby came on, talks about that, talks about all kinds of things. We had C. Rose Smith, who's the assistant curator of photography at the Brooks. That was a great conversation. And last week we had Jennifer Chandler, food writer, as well as Tim Barker, who used to run Edge Alley and has been in restaurants in Memphis forever, talking about restaurants and what all the comings and goings, as it were, in restaurants in Memphis. In terms of Behind the Headlines, we recently had Brent Taylor, the state senator, and Josh Spickler, criminal justice reformer, on for a really good, really intense, but I think really good debate about crime, criminal justice, and public safety. We also had an interview with the new president of CBU, Christian Brothers University, the interim president, as well as the head of the board of directors, as they kind of climb out of the hole they went into and are feeling pretty good about where they're going. Coming up soon on Behind the Headlines, Frederick Agee, who's the district attorney from the rural counties around Shelby County, some of those, Haywood, Gibson, another one they just forgot, and he's going to be on talking about things he's got going and some of the fire that Shelby County District Attorney Steve Mulroy is taking. And then we've got Tina Sullivan, who is the executive director of Overton Park Conservancy, who announced her retirement, I think at the end of the year, give or take. A friend of mine, and used to be on the board of the OPC and went through a lot of stuff with her. So we will have her on Behind the Headlines soon, talking about her, I think, decade now, heading the park. So Willy, you've talked a bit about, you're writing. I'm always kind of interested in people's writing process. I mean, are you a morning person? Are you a late night person? Are you a structured everyday person? Or is it, you've got, like you said, you've got periods of time where you just can't write because you've got other projects going on. Yeah. Just, you write on a computer or a pencil?
I do. I write on computer, and I've been using Google Docs. I wrote this book. I wrote the first version of it just in Microsoft Word, and the next one, when I started unwinding that, I started using Google Docs, and so it was just easier to send. My wife Kim edited the book for me, so she had access to things. When she had time, she would just go access the Google Doc, which is great. Yeah. But I think I do better. I like to write early in the morning, 7, 8 o'clock, get in there, write for 2 or 3 hours. When I was writing the book as the novel, I wrote a lot I had a house down in Rolling Fork, and I wrote a lot then. It's very quiet, and I could do that. But writing this, I would just whenever I could carve out 30 minutes, I would think, okay, I can go in and edit this now, or let me go in and read what I wrote last week and see what changes I want to make first. Yeah. So I was just always doing maintenance work on what I had written 10 years before and the new stuff I was writing, and then getting new ideas about, I think I want to tell this story. And then I would just sit down and just bang out a new story, and it might be 3,000 or 4,000 words, and do that, and then send it to the editor, and then go back and make the changes. Yeah. So I just kind of grab time when I can. Yeah. It's hard for me to make like a date, okay, don't anybody bother me, that's hard for me.
Yeah. So, people know you as a filmmaker. talk about what's going on that side of your life.
We've talked about my hometown, Rolling Fork, and Rolling Fork got literally blown away in the tornado a little over a year ago, about 15 months ago. And my filmmaking partner, George Larimore, and I have been working on 3 documentaries, 3 half-hour documentaries for Mississippi Public TV. The last one, part 3, is coming on the air, I think, August 17th on MPB. They will also have it so people can go on and see that online. Yeah. So you can go to MPB online and watch that. But part 3, we kind of, nothing ever ends. Yeah. Nothing ever ends. But we went back and George talked to a lot of the people that he had followed through these other 2 parts. And a lot of it's heartbreaking, but a lot of it is also, you feel like, humanity is at work here and people are being their best version of themselves. So many of the people down there are very poor. And those people were always renters. Very few people owned their own homes down there. Now, since they're building back, the Rolling Fork Rising, which is a nonprofit that a bunch of people down there started, they started putting people in their own homes. They're paying exactly what they paid in rent, but they own their own homes. And I think this is going to create generational change down there. And I believe that's what the Delta needed. And they didn't need to be destroyed, but if this had to happen, then it's great that this is what's come out of it. I write a lot about the Delta of the 1950s and 60s in this book. Yeah. And it's tough. It was tough to write. It was tough to live that and see the people that I loved and respected kind of turn a blind eye to the racism and things like that. So I talk a lot about that in the book too.
Staying with the tornado, those are the kind of events that a town like that might never come back from. Whether that's a town on the coast that's flooded or that's a hurricane or it's an earthquake. Did you have that sense at any point in this that, this town is so on the edge anyway in terms of poverty, in terms of its struggles and its history, it may not come back?
Right. And so many people told us that as we talked to people who told the story. Yeah. And they've lost, I don't know, probably a third of the population. And the population was about 1,800. So, and then you start looking at those linchpin situations. If the hospital is not built back, then what happens? The hospital and the school are the 2 biggest employers there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So what do you do if you don't have those? People can't stay there. And so it's a very dire situation, and it's still, there are tipping points all over the place. I hope they'll come back. I hope it'll be better than ever. We talked with Representative Benny Thompson, and he has put a lot of money into that, a lot of thought into this. So, but it's still really up in the air. Yeah, yeah.
What else? When you finish that, do you, in terms of documentaries and filmmaking, are you then in your mind or in reality working on your next project as you wrap up this one? Do you know?
Always. Yeah, I always have 3 or 4 projects I'm working on. And some things are, I'm just kind of writing and making notes about things. Some things I'm shooting some interviews with people and, thinking, okay, if nothing ever happens with this, it will be in my archive, which will go, hopefully to the University of Memphis Library or wherever, it winds up ultimately going. Just a lot of that stuff. So I'm always looking and thinking about things like that and kind of building the foundation of things. And some things maybe will get finished and some things will probably never get finished.
Does it bother you to think they won't get finished, or is that just part of the cycle?
Yeah, it does, because, most of what I've done out of my own pocket. Yeah. And it's tough. It's tough. People are always saying, oh, man, you're Memphis's history filmmaker, blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking, but nobody ever helped me. I mean, had I not had to do all the other jobs. And I've been so thankful that, I still produce corporate shows. I do the Blues Music Awards, the Blues Hall of Fame. I mean, I do all these things that keep me like going and keep me busy. But had I not had those things, if I had had the luxury of taking, I'm going to take 3 months and finish this documentary, I don't know what I could have accomplished. But I will say this, I think I've accomplished a lot. And I'm going to keep doing that. I realized a long time ago that, arts organizations weren't looking for me. I did go to a arts organization one time and said, hey, listen, I'm doing these films and blah, blah, blah. I'd like to do this. And they said, but you're not a nonprofit. And just wouldn't even, they looked at me like I was crazy. You're not a nonprofit. Well, I know I'm not, but I'm doing these things and I think they're good for the community. So, you live with that.
Yeah, I went on my rant recently about nonprofits, and I won't go on again. I was talking to Nancy Wilson from the Shell, from the Overton Park Shell, and that if you do something good for the community, it ought to be done for free. That mentality that some people... Exactly. Not a lot, but some people have. Like, but the work is what's important to you, Willie.
Yeah, right.
You're not worried about eating
That's
or
right.
having a roof.
Yeah, and I, but I always tell people, this is my hobby too. It's my hobby time that I have done, Overton Park and Elmwood Cemetery and the Garage Band documentary and all these things. That's my hobby time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's cool too. I am I've lived a charmed life and what I think left behind speaks for itself.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's amazing. We're just a minute left here. Again, the book is Mississippi Hippie, A Life in 49 Pieces. People can get it on Amazon. They can get it novel here in Memphis. Yeah. Audiobooks coming out as soon as it gets wrapped
probably
up.
in a week or so. They've got to wave their hand.
Yeah.
Audible has to wave their hands over it. And I think it's gonna be good.
Okay. And I wrote it down as Mississippi Pool Hall Existentialism. That's your next book. And the title of the article that I'm going to do as part of this interview. So
that's great.
Full credit to you.
I'm glad I thought of that.
I'm
glad it resonated with you because it was kind of existential in, my basic thinking and listening to people and all that. So, so thanks for kind of making me say that.
And again, I know I asked you last time you were on, but I ask everybody, the first concert you went to.
Yeah. First concert I went to was, Herman's Hermits and the Animals.
That's right.
No, I'm sorry, the Dave Clark 5 and the Animals in Jackson, Mississippi at the Coliseum.
That's good.
Oh, man. We stopped at the Tom McCann's in Jackson, and we all bought Beatle boots. Yes.
That's amazing. All right, Willy Bearden, thanks for being here. But that is all the time we have this week. If you missed any of the show, you can get it at the Daily Memphian, you can get it at WYXR, or you can get it as a podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next week.